A black woman casually helps a millionaire CEO fix his computer, but when he notices the ring on her finger, his entire expression changes, and what he does next leaves everyone speechless. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel, and let's get started. Yvonne Porter's fingers danced across the keyboard with practiced precision, each keystroke a note in a symphony she had mastered over 15 years of IT work. The black woman's dark eyes narrowed behind fashionable rectangular glasses as she concentrated on the stubborn code that had crashed the CEO's entire system. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive office, New York City sprawled beneath them, a concrete jungle bathed in the golden glow of late-afternoon sunshine. Any luck? The deep voice of Alexander Kingsley, CEO of Kingsley Enterprises, interrupted her concentration. He loomed behind her, his expensive cologne invading her space. 6'3" of impatience in a $3,000 suit. "I'd have better luck if you weren't hovering," Yvonne replied without looking up, her voice calm but firm. Unlike most of the staff who walked on eggshells around the notoriously demanding CEO, Yvonne didn't feel the need to genuflect. She'd been contracted to fix a problem, and that required focus, not fawning. Alexander raised an eyebrow, unused to being addressed so directly by anyone in his orbit. Most people scurried away from his presence or nodded eagerly at his every word. This woman did neither. He stepped back, finding himself oddly captivated by the confidence with which she worked. "How much longer?" he asked, checking his Patek Philippe watch. "I have a board meeting in 30 minutes, and those files are critical." Yvonne suppressed a sigh. "These things take time, Mr. Kingsley. Your system wasn't just crashed, it was corrupted. Someone tried to access files they shouldn't have." "Are you saying we were hacked?" Alexander's voice sharpened. "Not externally," Yvonne clarified, her fingers never pausing. "This was an inside job. Someone in your company with access privileges tried to copy confidential files and triggered the security protocols I installed last month. The system did exactly what it was designed to do. It locked everything down." Alexander cursed under his breath, already mentally cycling through potential culprits. The corporate espionage he'd suspected was now confirmed. "Can you tell who?" "Give me 10 more minutes," Yvonne said, finally glancing up at him. "I'll not only have your system restored, but also the employee ID of whoever tried to breach it." For a moment, their eyes locked. Alexander was struck by the quiet determination in her gaze. No false promises, no nervous platitudes, just competent assurance. It was refreshing in a world where most people told him what they thought he wanted to hear. 10 minutes, he conceded, moving toward the window to give her space. Alexander gazed out at the empire he'd built, 45 floors above Manhattan. Kingsley Enterprises had grown from a modest software company into a tech conglomerate under his leadership. At 38, he was among the youngest CEOs of a Fortune 500 company, with a personal net worth that had recently crossed the billion-dollar threshold. Yet success had come with isolation. He had associates, not friends, admirers, not equals, and he'd grown accustomed to the solitude at the top. "Got it," Yvonne announced, breaking his reverie. Alexander turned to find her looking satisfied, her work completed with 2 minutes to spare. He crossed the room quickly, leaning over her shoulder to see the screen. "The system is back online, all files intact," she explained. "And here's your culprit." She pointed to a user log showing the ID of his chief financial officer, Walter Chambers. Alexander's jaw tightened. "Walter? But he's been with me since the beginning." "The logs don't lie," Yvonne said, standing and gathering her equipment. "He tried to access and copy your merger plans with Takashi Technologies at 2:14 this morning." As she reached for her tablet, a sunbeam caught the ring on her left hand, sending prisms of light dancing across the desk. Alexander's eyes were drawn to it, not a diamond engagement ring as one might expect, but something more unique. a burnished gold band inlaid with a pattern of intricate symbols that seemed somehow familiar to him. "Interesting ring," he remarked, his curiosity piqued. Yvonne's expression softened slightly, her fingers instinctively touching the band. "It was my mother's. She passed it to me before she died." "I'm sorry for your loss," Alexander said, surprised by his own sincerity. "The design is unusual. What do the symbols represent?" "They're Adinkra symbols from Ghana. My mother said the ring has been in our family for generations," she explained, a hint of pride in her voice. "Each symbol has meaning: perseverance, wisdom, strength." "It's beautiful," Alexander said, finding himself genuinely intrigued not just by the ring, but by the woman wearing it. In his world of transactional relationships, Yvonne Porter stood out as refreshingly authentic. "Thank you for salvaging my files. Your reputation is well deserved." Yvonne nodded, slipping her equipment into a sleek leather messenger bag. "Just doing my job, Mr. Kingsley." "Alexander," he corrected her, earning a surprised look. "After saving me from what would have been a disastrous board meeting, I think we can drop the formalities." A small, measured smile appeared on Yvonne's face. "Alexander, then. Though if your board is meeting in 15 minutes, you might want to review those files I recovered." He checked his watch, grimacing at the time. "You're right." He hesitated, then added, "Actually, would you mind waiting? After the meeting, I'd like to discuss upgrading our entire security system. Walter's betrayal suggests we need a complete overhaul." Yvonne considered him for a moment. "I have another client at 6. I'll only need 30 minutes of your time. The board meeting should wrap up by 5:15. He paused, then added, "I'll double your hourly rate for the inconvenience." "It's not about the money," she replied, adjusting her glasses with a slight frown. "But I suppose I can rearrange some things." She took out her phone, sent a quick text, then nodded. "I'll wait." "Thank you," Alexander said, already gathering his files. "Feel free to use my office. Order whatever you'd like from the executive dining room." As Alexander headed to his board meeting, his mind was uncharacteristically divided. Part of him was focused on the betrayal by Walter and the implications for the company, but another part kept returning to the IT specialist with the unique ring and direct manner. Something about Yvonne Porter had caught his attention in a way that few people ever did. The board meeting proceeded with clinical efficiency. Walter Chambers was conspicuously absent, having called in sick that morning, a fact that now appeared suspicious in light of his nocturnal activities. Alexander presented the recovered merger documents, watching his board members' faces carefully for any sign of complicity. The deal with Takashi Technologies would expand their reach into Asian markets, a strategic move that had been months in the planning and completely confidential until today. Throughout the meeting, Alexander maintained his usual commanding presence, but his thoughts occasionally drifted back to his office where Yvonne Porter was waiting. He found himself wondering about her background, her story. In his experience, people with her level of competence typically had fascinating journeys. When the meeting concluded, Alexander declined the usual post-meeting drinks with the board members and returned to his office. He found Yvonne working on her laptop, a half-empty cup of tea beside her. "Productive meeting?" she asked, closing her laptop as he entered. "As productive as possible, given the circumstances," Alexander replied, loosening his tie slightly. "I've already instructed security to escort Walter from the premises when he returns. The legal team is preparing to file charges." Yvonne nodded, unsurprised. "Corporate espionage carries serious penalties. Do you know who he was working for?" "Not yet, but I intend to find out." Alexander moved to the small bar in the corner of his office and poured himself a scotch. "Can I offer you something?" "No, thank you. I don't drink while working." She declined politely. Alexander took a seat across from her, studying her face more carefully than he had earlier. Yvonne Porter was beautiful, though she clearly didn't emphasize it in a conventional sense. no excessive makeup or affected mannerisms. Her dark skin was flawless, her short, natural hair styled in a way that framed her face perfectly, and her brown eyes held an intelligence that he found compelling. "So, about your security system," Yvonne began. "All business? After today's incident, I'd recommend a complete restructuring of your access protocols. The current framework is outdated, leaving too many vulnerabilities." Alexander listened as she outlined a comprehensive security plan, impressed by her technical knowledge and strategic thinking. He found himself nodding along, trusting her assessment almost instinctively, a rarity for him. Trust did not come easily to Alexander Kingsley, a man who had learned early in his career that motives were rarely pure in the business world. "How soon could you implement these changes?" he asked when she finished. "With a dedicated team, 2 weeks. Alone, probably a month," Yvonne answered honestly. "I want you to lead the project," Alexander decided. "Assemble whatever team you need. Budget is not a concern. Security is." Yvonne looked surprised. "Mr. Kings, Alexander, I'm a consultant, not a contractor. I typically troubleshoot specific issues, not oversee extended projects." "I'm aware of your usual arrangement," he replied, "but I need someone I can trust, and today you proved yourself to be that person. Name your price." She hesitated, clearly weighing the offer. "It would mean postponing my other clients." "I'll compensate you for any losses," Alexander assured her. "This is priority 1 for Kingsley Enterprises right now." Yvonne studied him as if trying to decipher his true motives. Finally, she nodded. "All right. I'll send you a proposal tomorrow with the team requirements and cost projections." "Excellent." Alexander smiled, feeling oddly satisfied. "We can start immediately." As they discussed the logistics, Alexander found himself increasingly drawn to Yvonne's mind, the way she thought through problems, her straightforward approach to challenges. It was rare for him to meet someone who saw the world as clearly as he did, without the distortions of flattery or fear. When they finished their business discussion, Alexander made an impulsive decision. "Have dinner with me," he said, then quickly added, "to celebrate our new partnership." Yvonne looked startled. "That's not necessary." "Perhaps not, but I'd enjoy the company," he admitted. "Unless you have other plans tonight?" She seemed to consider him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I don't typically mix business with pleasure, Alexander." "Neither do I," he assured her. "But making an exception once won't compromise our professional relationship. Just dinner to discuss the project further." Yvonne glanced at her watch, then back at him. Something in her expression shifted slightly. "One dinner," she agreed finally. "But I choose the place. Somewhere without paparazzi or business associates interrupting every 5 minutes." Alexander smiled, surprised by the small thrill of victory he felt. "Deal. Where did you have in mind?" "There's a small Ethiopian restaurant in Harlem. Best food in the city, but I doubt any of your board members have ever set foot there." A hint of challenge flickered in her eyes. "Sounds perfect," Alexander replied, already reaching for his phone to cancel his evening appointments. "I'll have my driver take us." Yvonne shook her head. "I have my car. I'll drive us there myself." Alexander raised an eyebrow, unused to relinquishing control but finding himself willing to bend his usual rules. "Lead the way, then." As they left his office together, Alexander couldn't help but glance again at the unusual ring on Yvonne's finger, catching the light as she gathered her belongings. Something about it nagged at the edges of his memory, like a half-forgotten dream. But he pushed the thought aside, focused instead on the unexpected evening ahead and the intriguing woman who had so efficiently disrupted his carefully ordered world. Neither of them could have guessed that the ring, and the secrets it represented, would soon unravel both their lives in ways they could never have imagined. The small Ethiopian restaurant was tucked between a barber shop and a family-owned bakery, its modest exterior belying the rich aromas that greeted them as they stepped inside. The space was intimate, with low lighting, colorful woven tapestries adorning the walls, and the soft melodic sounds of Ethiopian jazz filling the air. It was worlds away from the sterile, upscale establishments Alexander typically frequented. Yvonne was greeted warmly by the owner, an older woman with silver-streaked hair who embraced her like family. "Yvonne, it's been too long," the woman exclaimed, before eyeing Alexander with undisguised curiosity. "Makita, this is Alexander," Yvonne introduced him simply, offering no explanation of his identity or their relationship, something Alexander found oddly refreshing. In his world, his name was always announced with reverence, his title and accomplishments recited like credentials. "Any friend of Yvonne's is welcome here," Makita said, leading them to a corner table partially secluded by hanging fabrics. "The usual, my dear?" Yvonne nodded, then glanced at Alexander. "Do you mind if I order for both of us? First time at an Ethiopian restaurant should be done properly." "By all means," Alexander agreed, settling into the surprisingly comfortable wooden chair. As Makita disappeared to the kitchen, he took in his surroundings more carefully. The other patrons, a diverse mix of people, paid them little attention, engaged in their own conversations and meals. No one approached for autographs or business propositions, no smartphones aimed in his direction for surreptitious photos. The anonymity was unexpectedly liberating. "You're smiling," Yvonne observed, removing her light jacket and draping it over the back of her chair. "Am I?" Alexander hadn't realized. "I suppose I'm enjoying the novelty of being a normal person for an evening." "Is it really that bad being Alexander Kingsley?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. He considered her question seriously. "Not bad, just isolated. Wealth and power create a barrier between you and the rest of the world. Everyone either wants something from you or is intimidated by you. Genuine connections become rare." "That sounds lonely," Yvonne said without pity, just honest observation. "It can be," he admitted, surprised by his own candor. "But it's a trade-off I accepted long ago. Success requires sacrifice." "Does it?" Yvonne challenged gently. "Or is that just what successful people tell themselves to justify the imbalance in their lives?" Before Alexander could respond, Makeda returned with a carafe of honey wine and 2 traditional drinking vessels. She poured the golden liquid with practiced grace before promising their food would arrive shortly. "To new partnerships," Alexander said, raising his glass. "Professional partnerships," Yvonne clarified with a slight emphasis, touching her glass to his. The honey wine was sweet with a complex undertone that Alexander couldn't quite identify. "This is excellent," he remarked, genuinely impressed. "Tej," Yvonne explained. "Traditional Ethiopian mead. My mother used to make it for special occasions." A shadow crossed her face at the mention of her mother, there and gone in an instant. "How long has she been gone?" Alexander asked quietly. 3 years, Yvonne replied, rotating her glass slowly. "Cancer. It was quick, at least. She didn't suffer long." "And your father?" "Left when I was 2. Never knew him." She shrugged slightly, as if it were an old, healed wound. "My mother raised me alone. She was remarkable. Worked 2 jobs while getting her nursing degree, never complained. Always made time for me." Yvonne's fingers unconsciously touched her ring again, a gesture Alexander was beginning to recognize as a habit when she spoke of her mother. "She sounds like an extraordinary woman," Alexander said sincerely. "She was." Yvonne looked up at him. "What about your family?" Alexander's expression remained neutral, though his grip on the glass tightened imperceptibly. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 12. I was raised by my grandfather after that." "I'm sorry," Yvonne said, her eyes softening. "That must have been incredibly difficult at that age." "It was a long time ago," Alexander replied with practiced detachment. "My grandfather was a good man, strict but fair. He taught me everything I know about business." "Is he still alive?" "No, he passed 10 years ago." So we're both orphans, Yvonne observed, a hint of unexpected connection in her voice. Before Alexander could respond, their food arrived. A large, shared platter with various colorful stews and preparations arranged on a base of spongy injera bread. Makita explained each dish as she set it down, naming spices and ingredients that were mostly unfamiliar to Alexander. "You eat with your hands," Yvonne explained, demonstrating by tearing a piece of the injera and using it to scoop up some of the spiced lentil stew. "Like this." Alexander, never one to shy away from a challenge, followed her example. The explosion of flavors was unlike anything he'd experienced. Earthy, spicy, tangy, and complex. "This is incredible," he said after his first bite, genuinely impressed. Yvonne smiled, the first full smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, illuminating her features and creating a warmth that Alexander found himself drawn to. "Told you. Best food in the city." As they ate, their conversation flowed more naturally. They discussed books they'd read, places they'd traveled, and even touched on politics, finding surprising common ground despite their different backgrounds. Alexander discovered that Yvonne had degrees in both computer science and anthropology, an unusual combination that explained her unique approach to cybersecurity. "Culture and code aren't that different," she explained. "Both are systems humans create to communicate and organize their worlds. Understanding the cultural context of security helps me anticipate how people will try to breach it." "That's a fascinating perspective," Alexander said, genuinely intrigued. "Most security experts I've met focus solely on the technical aspects." "That's why most security systems fail," Yvonne replied. "They forget that behind every hack is a human being with motivations and cultural conditioning." As she spoke, Alexander's eyes were drawn again to her ring. Under the restaurant's warm lighting, the symbols seemed to shift and dance, almost as if they were alive. "You keep looking at my ring," Yvonne noted, catching his gaze. Alexander didn't deny it. "There's something familiar about it. I can't quite place it." Yvonne extended her hand so he could see it better. "These are Adinkra symbols from the Akan people of Ghana. This one represents wisdom." She pointed to a spiral-like design. "This one is strength." She indicated another that resembled an abstract heart. "And this?" She pointed to what appeared to be an elaborate knot. "Represents unity and human relations." Alexander leaned closer, studying the intricate designs. The gold had a distinctive reddish hue that was uncommon in modern jewelry. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward her hand. After a slight hesitation, Yvonne nodded. Alexander gently took her hand, bringing the ring closer to examine it. The sensation of her skin against his sent an unexpected current through him, but he maintained his composure, focusing on the symbols. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary," he observed. "This isn't modern work." "My mother said it's at least 200 years old," Yvonne confirmed, "passed down through generations of women in our family." As Alexander turned her hand slightly to see the inside of the band, he noticed an additional marking, what appeared to be a small, stylized bird. Something about it triggered a distant memory, like an echo from a forgotten dream. He blinked, suddenly disoriented. "Are you all right?" Yvonne asked, withdrawing her hand with a concerned expression. "Yes, sorry." Alexander composed himself quickly. "Just reminded me of something, but I can't quite place it." He took a sip of water, trying to clear the strange fog that had momentarily descended over his thoughts. "Did your mother tell you anything else about the ring's origins?" Yvonne's expression grew more guarded. "Only fragments. Our family history wasn't well documented for obvious reasons. Many of our ancestors were enslaved, their stories deliberately erased." Her voice held no self-pity, just a matter-of-fact acknowledgement of historical truth. "The ring is one of the few tangible connections to our past." Alexander nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "History is written by the powerful, and too often they write others out of existence." "Exactly," Ivan looked slightly surprised at his perception. The ring is proof that we existed, that we had culture and artistry and knowledge before others tried to strip it away. Their conversation was interrupted by Makita bringing traditional coffee in small cups, the rich aroma filling the air around them. Ethiopian coffee ceremony, Ivan explained. The perfect end to the meal. As they sipped the intensely flavorful coffee, Alexander found himself more relaxed than he'd been in longer than he could remember. There was something about Ivan's presence, her authenticity, her directness, that cut through the usual pretenses he maintained. "Thank you for bringing me here," he said sincerely. "This has been refreshing." Ivan studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. "You're not what I expected, Alexander Kingsley. What did you expect? Someone more—" She searched for the right word. "Imperious. Your reputation precedes you." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly is my reputation?" "Brilliant but ruthless, demanding perfection, not suffering fools gladly." She set down her cup. "The tech world is full of stories about your exacting standards and zero tolerance for failure." "All true," Alexander acknowledged without apology. "Excellence requires high standards." "There's a difference between high standards and impossible ones," Ivan countered. "Perhaps," he conceded, "but I've built Kingsley Enterprises on that principle and it served me well." "At what cost?" The question was gentle but direct. Alexander didn't immediately answer. It was a question he rarely allowed himself to consider. Finally, he said, "Every choice has consequences." The evening ended with Alexander insisting on paying despite Ivan's protests. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, the city hummed around them, a different energy than the corporate world they would return to tomorrow. "I'll drive you home," Ivan offered as they approached her car, a well-maintained but modest sedan. "Actually, would you mind taking me back to the office? My driver can pick me up there," Alexander requested. "Sure," she agreed, unlocking the doors. The drive was quiet but comfortable, each lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived at Kingsley Tower, Alexander turned to her before getting out. "I look forward to working with you on the security overhaul," he said, his voice more formal than it had been during dinner, as if he were already stepping back into his CEO persona. "I'll have the proposal on your desk by 10 tomorrow," Ivan assured him, equally professional. Alexander hesitated, then added, "Perhaps we could do this again sometime. I'd like to hear more about your anthropological approach to security." A small smile touched Ivan's lips. "Maybe. Let's see how the professional part works out first." As Alexander watched her drive away, he was struck by an unusual sensation, a mixture of anticipation and unease. Something about Ivan Porter had gotten under his skin, past the carefully constructed barriers he maintained. And that ring, the image of the small stylized bird inside the band, continued to tug at his memory, like a half-forgotten song from childhood. Back in his penthouse, Alexander found himself opening his grandfather's old wooden chest, something he hadn't done in years. Among the carefully preserved mementos, he searched for a particular item, a nagging suspicion forming in his mind. Alexander's fingers moved methodically through his grandfather's possessions, each item a carefully preserved memory of Elijah Kingsley's remarkable life. Business ledgers from the early days of what would become Kingsley Enterprises, faded photographs of his grandfather with various dignitaries and business partners, vintage watches that had stopped telling time decades ago. The chest smelled of cedar and history, a time capsule Alexander rarely disturbed. Near the bottom, wrapped in a silk handkerchief, he found what he was looking for, a small wooden box with intricate carvings on its surface. Alexander's heart quickened as he carefully opened it. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, lay a gold pocket watch. It had belonged to his great-grandfather, one of the few family heirlooms that had survived generations. Alexander lifted it carefully, feeling its substantial weight in his palm. He turned it over, and there it was, The same stylized bird he had glimpsed inside Yvonne's ring, engraved into the back of the watch case. Alexander stared at it, his mind racing. It couldn't be a coincidence. This symbol, this specific design, was unique to his family. His grandfather had told him it represented freedom and legacy, a personal emblem his great-grandfather had created when he established the family's first business venture. How could it possibly be on a ring that had supposedly been in Yvonne Porter's family for generations? Alexander carefully returned the watch to its box, his thoughts in turmoil. There had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps the design was less unique than his grandfather had led him to believe. Maybe it was a common symbol he wasn't familiar with. Yet the nagging feeling persisted. There was a connection here, one he couldn't yet understand. His phone chimed with a message from his security chief confirming that Walter Chambers had been denied entry to the building that afternoon and was now under surveillance. Alexander sent a curt acknowledgement, his mind still preoccupied with the watch and the ring. Tomorrow, he would begin seeking answers. The next morning, Yvonne arrived at Kingsley Tower precisely at 9:30, professional and focused as if their dinner had never happened. She had assembled a team of 3 additional security specialists who were setting up in a dedicated conference room on the executive floor. "Good morning," Alexander greeted her as he entered the room, coffee in hand. He had slept poorly, his dreams filled with fragments of memories and questions about the bird symbol. "Morning," Yvonne replied, not looking up from her laptop. "I've emailed the full proposal to your assistant. We can begin the first phase immediately if you approve." "I've already approved it," Alexander said, setting his coffee down and taking a seat across from her. "My CFO, the interim one, has been instructed to provide whatever resources you need." Now Yvonne did look up, studying him briefly. "That was fast." "I don't waste time when security is compromised," Alexander replied simply. He hesitated, then added, "I enjoyed dinner last night." "So did I," Yvonne acknowledged with a small but genuine smile. "Makita asked when you're coming back. Apparently you impressed her by eating with your hands without making a mess. She says most first-timers are much clumsier." Alexander felt an unexpected warmth at this simple compliment from a restaurant owner who had no idea who he was. "I'd be happy to return. The food was excellent." Their brief personal exchange was interrupted as Yvonne's team members entered, and the day promptly shifted into work mode. Alexander left them to their initial assessments, returning to his office to deal with the fallout from Walter's betrayal. His legal team had discovered that Walter had been in contact with their chief competitor, Vertex Technologies, in the weeks leading up to his attempted theft of the merger documents. The timing was suspicious. Vertex had recently made an aggressive move into Asian markets, precisely where Kingsley's merger with Takashi would strengthen their position. By midday, Alexander had authorized a quiet but thorough investigation into Vertex's activities. If they were engaging in corporate espionage, he wanted irrefutable proof before making any accusations. He was reviewing the preliminary security report from Yvonne's team when his assistant announced her arrival. Yvonne entered his office with tablet in hand, her expression serious. "We've found additional security breaches," she said without preamble. "Whoever accessed your system didn't just target the Takashi merger files. They were exploring personnel records, specifically executive biographies and background checks." Alexander frowned. "Background checks? That's unusual for corporate espionage. Typically, they'd go after product designs, client lists, or financial projections." "Exactly," Yvonne agreed, taking a seat across from him. "This wasn't just about stealing business intelligence. Someone was looking for personal information about your leadership team." "Or about me," Alexander speculated, his mind immediately connecting this to his lingering questions about the symbol. "Possibly," Yvonne conceded. "The system logs show particular interest in your personal file and those of your direct reports." Alexander's expression darkened. "Any indication of what they were looking for specifically?" Not yet, but we're tracing the digital footprints. Ivan studied him. You don't seem surprised. Alexander considered how much to share. Let's just say I've recently discovered some inconsistencies that make me wonder if someone is digging into my family history. Ivan raised an eyebrow. Care to elaborate? Alexander hesitated, then made a decision. Last night, after our dinner, I found something that connects to your ring. The bird symbol on the inside band. It's also on a watch that belonged to my great-grandfather. Ivan's expression shifted from professional interest to personal concern. That's not possible. This ring has been in my mother's family for generations, passed down from mother to daughter. I know. That's why it's troubling me. Alexander leaned forward. Your family is from Ghana originally, correct? On my mother's side, yes, though the history is fragmented because of slavery. Ivan's voice had taken on a guarded quality. My ancestors were brought to America in the early 1800s, according to what little family history my mother knew. Alexander nodded slowly. My great-grandfather established Kingsley Trading Company in 1892. The bird was his personal symbol. He had it engraved on all his important possessions. It was meant to represent freedom and legacy. What are you suggesting? Ivan asked, her tone careful. I'm not sure yet, Alexander admitted, but it seems like too specific a coincidence. And now with someone accessing background information on the executive team, you think someone is investigating a connection between your family and mine? The skepticism in Ivan's voice was evident. It's a possibility we can't dismiss, Alexander replied, especially with the timing of Walter's betrayal and these additional breaches you've discovered. Ivan was silent for a moment, processing this information. I'd need to see this watch to compare the symbols. They could be similar, but not identical. Of course, Alexander agreed. It's at my apartment. Perhaps you could come by this evening to see it. Ivan gave him a measured look. This isn't some elaborate ploy to continue our personal interaction, is it? Alexander couldn't help but smile slightly. If I wanted to do that, I'd simply ask you to dinner again. This is about a potential security concern that might extend beyond corporate espionage into personal matters. After a moment's consideration, Ivan nodded. All right, text me your address. I'll stop by around 7 after we finish the initial system diagnostics. Thank you, Alexander said, relieved she was taking his concerns seriously. As Ivan rose to leave, Alexander added, There's one more thing. Did your mother ever mention how your family came to possess the ring? Any stories about where it originated? Ivan hesitated at the door. Only fragments. She said one of our ancestors was given the ring by a white man who had loved her, before the Civil War. It was supposed to be a promise of freedom that never came. Her expression grew distant. My mother believed he had good intentions but lacked the courage to fulfill his promise. It's why she taught me never to depend on anyone else for my freedom or success. With that, she left, leaving Alexander with even more questions than before. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and decisions, but his mind kept returning to the symbol and the possible connection between his family and Ivan's. At precisely 7 o'clock, his private elevator announced a visitor. Alexander had just enough time to set out the watch and pour 2 glasses of wine before Ivan arrived, looking slightly less formal than she had at the office. She had changed from her business suit into dark jeans and a deep burgundy sweater that complemented her complexion. Her professional demeanor remained intact, however. Nice place, she commented, taking in the expansive penthouse with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. The space was tastefully decorated in neutral tones with strategic pops of color, modern but not cold. Thank you, Alexander replied, leading her to the living area where he had set the wooden box on the coffee table. Can I offer you wine? Ivan hesitated, then accepted the glass he held out. Just one. I'm still working, technically. Of course. Alexander gestured toward the box. "This is what I wanted to show you." Yvonne set her wine down untouched and carefully opened the box. She removed the gold pocket watch, examining it with the methodical attention she gave to her technical work. When she turned it over and saw the bird symbol on the back, her breath caught audibly. "It's identical," she whispered, quickly removing her ring to compare the two symbols side by side. The stylized bird, with its distinctive curved neck and outstretched wings, was unmistakably the same design on both items. "How is this possible?" Alexander sat beside her, looking at the two family heirlooms now placed next to each other on his coffee table. "That's what I've been asking myself since last night. The only logical explanation is that at some point our families intersected." Yvonne's expression was troubled. Given the time periods and the nature of American history, that intersection would almost certainly have been during slavery. "Yes," Alexander acknowledged quietly, "which means my ancestors may have owned yours." The weight of this possibility hung heavy in the air between them. Alexander watched Yvonne's face as she processed this, her expert's eyes moving back and forth between the two symbols, seeking any difference that might disprove their connection. "Do you have any family records?" she finally asked. "Journals, letters, documentation of family history?" "Some," Alexander replied. "My grandfather was meticulous about preserving family documents. Most are in storage, but I have the key items here." He hesitated, then added, "I've been researching my family history in my spare time for years, building a genealogical record. I've always believed that understanding where we come from helps guide where we're going." "I've tried to do the same," Yvonne admitted, finally reaching for her wine. "But the records for enslaved people are sparse and often distorted. My mother hired a genealogist before she died, but they couldn't get further back than my great-great-grandmother." Alexander took a thoughtful sip of his wine. "Perhaps together we can fill in some of the gaps. If our families are connected, combining our research might provide answers for both of us." Yvonne studied him, her expression guarded but curious. "Why does this matter to you, Alexander? What difference would it make to your life if your ancestors owned mine?" It was a direct question that deserved an honest answer. Alexander considered carefully before responding. "History shapes us, whether we acknowledge it or not. If my family's wealth and privilege were built in part on the exploitation of your ancestors, that's a truth I need to face, not to wallow in guilt, but to understand the full context of my inheritance." Yvonne's gaze remained steady on his face, as if she were assessing the sincerity of his words. Finally, she nodded once, a gesture of cautious acceptance. "All right," she said, "let's see what we can discover together." Over the next few days, Alexander and Yvonne established a rhythm. During business hours, they maintained a strictly professional relationship as Yvonne led the security overhaul of Kingsley Enterprises. Her team worked methodically through the company's systems, uncovering and patching vulnerabilities, while Alexander dealt with the fallout of Walter's betrayal. Vertex Technologies had vehemently denied any involvement in corporate espionage, but Alexander's investigators had uncovered communications suggesting otherwise. In the evenings, however, a different kind of partnership emerged. They met at Alexander's penthouse, away from curious eyes, to piece together their family histories. Alexander had his grandfather's journals, photographs, and business records brought from storage. Yvonne contributed the thin file of documents her mother had collected, birth certificates, census records, and the genealogist's report that had traced her maternal line back to a woman named Esther, born around 1845 in South Carolina. "This is where the trail goes cold," Yvonne explained on their third night of research, spreading the documents across Alexander's dining table. The genealogist could find no record of Esther before the 1870 census, when she appears as a free woman with a young daughter. Alexander was poring over his great-grandfather's ledger from 1892, the founding year of Kingsley Trading Company. "What was her last name in the census?" "Porter," Yvonne replied. but that likely wasn't her original name. Former slaves often took new surnames after emancipation. Alexander nodded, his fingers tracing the elegant, faded script in the ledger. William Kingsley, my great-grandfather, was born in 1851. He would have been a teenager during the Civil War and in his early 20s during Reconstruction. He looked up at Yvonne. His father, however, owned a plantation in South Carolina. Kingsley Plantation. Yvonne's eyes widened slightly. South Carolina? That's where Esther was from? The plantation was sold after the war, Alexander continued. The family moved north to New York in 1868. William started a small trading company that eventually became what Kingsley Enterprises is today. When did he start using the bird symbol? Yvonne asked, unconsciously touching her ring. The earliest record I have is from 1875, when he registered it as his business mark. Alexander slid a document across the table, a faded registration form with the familiar bird symbol drawn in precise detail. Yvonne studied it, then removed her ring to compare the designs again. "It's unmistakable," she murmured. "But how did my ancestor come to have the same symbol on her ring?" Alexander hesitated, then suggested carefully, "Perhaps William knew Esther." The implication hung in the air between them. Yvonne's expression remained neutral, but Alexander could see the tension in her shoulders. "You're suggesting that your great-grandfather had a relationship with my ancestor." "It's one possibility," Alexander acknowledged. "The timing would fit with what your mother told you, about the ring being a gift from a white man before the Civil War. William would have been too young," Yvonne pointed out. "If he was born in 1851, he would have been only a teenager before the war ended." "True," Alexander conceded. "Perhaps it was his father then, Jonathan Kingsley." He reached for another journal, this one older and more worn than the others. "My grandfather mentioned that Jonathan was considered progressive for his time, though that's certainly relative given the era." As the night deepened, they continued piecing together fragments of history, searching for intersections between their families. By midnight, they had created a rough timeline spanning from 1840 to 1900, marking known events in both family histories. "We need more specific information about Esther," Alexander said, rubbing his tired eyes. "Census records and birth certificates only tell us so much." Yvonne nodded, stretching her neck after hours bent over documents. "And we need to know more about your great-grandfather's early years, when and how he acquired that symbol." Alexander closed the ledger he'd been examining. "I know someone who might be able to help. A historian at Columbia who specializes in 19th century American business history. I funded her research last year." "Of course you did," Yvonne said with a hint of a smile. "Is there anyone in New York you haven't financially supported at some point?" "Probably quite a few people," Alexander replied, returning her smile. "But Dr. Hernandez is exceptional at what she does. She might be able to point us in the right direction." Yvonne began carefully organizing the documents, her methodical nature extending beyond her technical work. "It's getting late. We should continue tomorrow." Alexander checked his watch, surprised to find it was nearly 1 in the morning. "You're right. Let me call my driver to take you home." "Not necessary," Yvonne declined. "I can get a rideshare." "At this hour? I'd prefer to know you got home safely." Yvonne gave him a measured look. "I've been getting myself home safely for years, Alexander, but if it makes you feel better, I'll text you when I arrive." He recognized the independence in her tone and nodded, respecting her boundaries. "Deal." As she gathered her things, Alexander found himself watching her movements, the graceful efficiency with which she handled the old documents, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when concentrating. He'd found himself increasingly drawn to her over these past few days, and not just because of their potential family connection. "What?" Yvonne asked, catching his gaze. "Nothing," Alexander replied quickly. "Just thinking about how strange life can be. A week ago, you were just another IT consultant. Now we're unearthing what might be a shared family history. I was never just another IT consultant. Yvonne corrected him with a raised eyebrow, but her tone was light. And yes, it is strange. Life rarely follows a predictable path. After she left, Alexander remained at the table, surrounded by the remnants of history. His phone chimed 20 minutes later with a text from Yvonne confirming her safe arrival home. He smiled, sending a quick reply before turning his attention back to Jonathan Kingsley's journal. The old leather-bound book contained mostly business notes and observations about politics of the era, but occasionally included more personal reflections. Alexander turned to an entry from 1860, just before the Civil War began. April 12, 1860, increasingly troubled by the political climate. Southern friends speak of secession as inevitable should Lincoln win the election. My business interests require peace, but my conscience cannot reconcile with the institution that underpins our economy. E continues to challenge my thinking in ways both uncomfortable and necessary. Alexander reread the entry, his attention caught by the mention of E. Could it be Esther? The timing would fit. But the entry revealed little about who E was or the nature of their relationship. He flipped forward several months. November 8, 1860. Lincoln has won. Talk of war increases daily. Must make arrangements to protect assets and family. William too young to understand the gravity of our situation. E urges me to take a public stand, but such a move would be financial suicide in this climate. Have promised to help in other ways. Another reference to E, this time suggesting a relationship close enough that this person was urging Jonathan Kingsley to take political action. Alexander continued reading, searching for additional mentions, but the entries became sporadic during the war years, focused mainly on business concerns and the safety of his family. Then, in an entry from June 1865, just after the war ended, June 20th, 1865, received word that E has safely reached Charleston with the child. The arrangement with Marcus Porter should provide some security, though I doubt it compares to what I promised. The war has depleted resources beyond what anyone anticipated. William asks questions about the bird design I created for E, too curious for his own good. Have told him it represents freedom, which is true enough, though incomplete. Alexander sat back, his mind racing. This was the first explicit connection. Jonathan Kingsley had created the bird design, apparently for someone named E, who had a child and had made arrangements with someone named Marcus Porter. If this E was indeed Yvonne's ancestor Esther, then the Porter surname connection would make sense. He read on, finding one final significant entry from 1868. September 3rd, 1868. Plantation sold at last, for far less than it's worth. We leave for New York next week. William is eager for the new start. I have made inquiries about E and the child through trusted channels, but information is scarce. The ring was delivered, I am told, though whether it reached its intended recipient remains unknown. It is a small token against a debt that can never truly be repaid. Alexander felt a chill run through him. The ring. Jonathan Kingsley had sent a ring to E, presumably Esther, around the time the Kingsley family moved north after selling their plantation. This had to be the ring that now adorned Yvonne's finger, passed down through generations of her family. But what was the debt that can never truly be repaid that Jonathan mentioned? And what was his relationship with Esther? The journal entries hinted at something more complex than simply a plantation owner and an enslaved woman. Alexander took photographs of the relevant entries to share with Yvonne the next day. As he prepared for bed, his mind whirled with questions and possibilities. If their families were indeed connected through Jonathan Kingsley and Esther, what did that mean for him and Yvonne? The potential implications were both personal and professional. He tried to imagine how Yvonne would react to these new discoveries. She was practical and measured in her responses, but this was deeply personal history that touched on painful aspects of American racial dynamics. Alexander respected her enough to know that she would want the unvarnished truth, whatever it revealed about their ancestors. The next morning, Alexander woke early and called Dr. Sofia Hernandez at Columbia University. After explaining his research project in general terms, she agreed to meet him that afternoon. Alexander then texted Yvonne about his findings from Jonathan's journal and the meeting with Dr. Hernandez. Yvonne's response came quickly. "Can reschedule security team for this afternoon. This takes priority. Send me the details." Alexander smiled at her directness. In just a few days, their partnership had evolved into something neither of them could have anticipated. He wasn't sure where this journey into the past would lead them, but he was increasingly certain that it would change both their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. As he prepared for his day, Alexander found himself looking forward to seeing Yvonne again with an anticipation that went beyond their historical investigation. Despite his best efforts to maintain professional boundaries, he was developing feelings for her that complicated their already complex situation. Whether she felt the same remained unclear. Yvonne Porter was not easy to read, and Alexander suspected that was by careful design. Columbia University's campus buzzed with activity as Alexander and Yvonne made their way toward the history department that afternoon. Students lounged on the grass, enjoying the warm spring day, while professors hurried between buildings with purposeful strides. The academic atmosphere was a world away from the corporate intensity of Kingsley Tower. Dr. Sofia Hernandez's office was exactly what one would expect of a historian. Bookshelves crammed with volumes, walls adorned with historical maps and photographs, and a desk covered in organized stacks of research papers. The woman herself, a petite but commanding presence in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair, greeted them with professional warmth. "Mr. Kingsley, a pleasure to see you again," she said, shaking Alexander's hand before turning to Yvonne. "And you must be Ms. Porter. Alexander mentioned you're researching a potential connection between your families." "That's right," Yvonne confirmed, taking the seat Dr. Hernandez offered. "We've discovered some overlapping elements in our family histories that seem too specific to be coincidental." Alexander placed the folder containing copies of Jonathan's journal entries and the photographs of both the pocket watch and Yvonne's ring on the desk. "We were hoping you might help us interpret what we've found and potentially point us toward additional resources." Dr. Hernandez adjusted her glasses and began examining the materials with the careful attention of a practiced researcher. She read through the journal entries twice before looking up at them. "These are fascinating primary sources," she said. "Jonathan Kingsley was an interesting figure in Southern business circles before the war, known for being less vocal about pro-slavery positions than many of his contemporaries, though he certainly benefited from the institution." "What can you tell us about Kingsley Plantation?" Alexander asked. "It was mid-size by South Carolina standards, about 30 enslaved individuals according to the 1860 census," Dr. Hernandez replied. "What makes it particularly interesting is that after the war, Jonathan Kingsley provided unusually generous settlements to some of his former slaves. Not all, but a select few. It was noted in regional papers because it was so uncommon." Yvonne leaned forward. "Do any records specify who received these settlements?" "I would need to check specific documentation," Dr. Hernandez said. "But I recall that one recipient was noted for being educated above her station, a woman who had served in the house rather than the fields." "Could her name have been Esther?" Yvonne asked, her voice steady despite the tension Alexander could see in her shoulders. Dr. Hernandez's eyes sparkled with academic interest. "Let me check something." She turned to her computer and began typing rapidly. After a few minutes of searching through digital archives, she nodded. "Yes, here it is. The Charleston Mercury, August 1865. A brief mention of Jonathan Kingsley arranging for the mulatto woman Esther and her child to receive a small property and modest stipend." Alexander and Yvonne exchanged a glance, the significance of this confirmation evident to both of them. "The child," Alexander said carefully. "Is there any mention of the child's name or age?" Dr. Hernandez scrolled through the article. Just that it was a young daughter, no name given. But there's something else interesting here. The article mentions that Esther was uncommonly literate and possessed skills in accounting unusual for her race and gender. Apparently, she had been keeping the plantation's books during the war years while Jonathan was attending to business in Charleston. That would explain the level of trust implied in the journal entries. Alexander noted, he was relying on her for more than typical household duties. Dr. Hernandez nodded, her expression thoughtful. The relationship between enslavers and enslaved was always complex, particularly when it came to women working in the household. There were occasionally relationships that, while fundamentally unequal due to the power dynamics, contained elements of genuine human connection. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I'm not romanticizing slavery. It was an inherently violent and exploitative system, but within that system, individual stories could be complicated. We believe Jonathan Kingsley may have fathered Esther's child, Yvonne stated directly, her gaze steady. And that he created this symbol, she pointed to the bird design for them, before sending Esther a ring bearing the same mark. Dr. Hernandez examined the images of the ring and pocket watch more closely. The craftsmanship is exquisite. This bird design is interesting. It incorporates elements of both West African symbolism and European heraldry, a deliberate blending of traditions, perhaps. Could you help us find more definitive evidence of the connection? Alexander asked. Birth records, property transfers, anything that might clarify the relationship. Absolutely, Dr. Hernandez replied, her academic curiosity clearly piqued. This kind of microhistory is valuable not just for your families, but for our broader understanding of the period. She made some notes on a pad. I have a graduate student who specializes in post-Civil War records from South Carolina. With your permission, I'd like to have her assist with this research. That would be very helpful, Alexander agreed, then glanced at Yvonne for confirmation. Yes, thank you, Yvonne added. We appreciate any assistance. As they were preparing to leave, Dr. Hernandez mentioned something that caught both their attention. You know, you're not the first people to inquire about Jonathan Kingsley recently. Alexander paused. Someone else has been researching him? Yes, a man came by about 3 weeks ago. Never gave his name, but he was particularly interested in Jonathan's family connections and any potential heirs outside his recognized bloodline. Dr. Hernandez frowned slightly. I found it odd at the time. He seemed less interested in the historical context and more in establishing specific genealogical links. Alexander and Yvonne exchanged a concerned look. Did he mention why he was interested? Yvonne asked. No, but he did photograph some of the same journal entries you've brought today. He had already located them somehow and wanted to verify their authenticity. Dr. Hernandez shrugged. Academic research is public, of course, but something about his approach seemed strategic rather than scholarly. Outside, as they walked back to Alexander's waiting car, Yvonne finally voiced what they were both thinking. This connects to the security breach. Someone's been investigating both our backgrounds, looking for this link between our families. The timing aligns, Alexander agreed. 3 weeks ago would have been just before Walter tried to steal the Takashi merger documents. But why? Yvonne asked, her brow furrowed. What would our family connection have to do with corporate espionage? Alexander opened the car door for her, his expression troubled. I don't know yet, but someone thinks it's valuable information, valuable enough to steal. The drive back to Kingsley Tower was largely silent, both lost in thought about the implications of what they'd learned. The connection between their families seemed increasingly certain, but the reason for a third party's interest remained mysterious. Come up to my office, Alexander said as they arrived. We should discuss next steps privately. In his office, with the door closed and the New York skyline stretching beyond the windows, Alexander poured them both a drink. Yvonne accepted the glass but didn't immediately drink. If Jonathan Kingsley is my ancestor, she said slowly, that would make us… Distant cousins of some kind. Alexander nodded, watching her face carefully. Several generations removed, but yes. How does that make you feel? Yvonne asked directly, her eyes meeting his. Alexander considered the question seriously. Truthfully, it doesn't change how I see you. If anything, discovering this connection explains why I felt drawn to you from the beginning, beyond your obvious competence and direct manner. Drawn to me? Yvonne raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Alexander hadn't meant to be quite so transparent, but he didn't retreat from the admission. Yes, I find you compelling, Yvonne, professionally and personally. Yvonne took a sip of her drink, her expression unreadable. Even knowing we might share a bloodline? Distant cousins hardly constitutes a meaningful genetic connection, Alexander pointed out. And I'm more interested in who you are than who your great-great-great-grandfather might have been. The moment hung between them, charged with possibilities. Yvonne set down her glass and stepped closer to him. You're a surprising man, Alexander Kingsley, she said softly. When we met, I expected an entitled CEO with more money than empathy. Instead, I've found someone willing to face uncomfortable truths about his family history. Someone who values understanding over ignorance. And you're not what I expected either, Alexander replied, setting his own glass down. I thought I was hiring a technical consultant. Instead, I found a partner in uncovering a history that belongs to both of us. Their eyes held for a long moment. Alexander wasn't sure who moved first, but suddenly they were kissing. Tentatively at first, then with growing certainty. Yvonne's hand came up to rest on his chest, and he could feel the metal of her ring warm against the fabric of his shirt, a tangible link to their shared past. When they broke apart, Yvonne stepped back slightly, her expression complicated. We should be careful, she warned, though her voice lacked conviction. This is already complex enough without adding more layers. I rarely do what's easy, Alexander admitted. Only what matters. Yvonne smiled at that, genuine and unguarded. I've noticed. Her phone chimed with a message, breaking the moment. She checked it, her expression shifting back to professional focus. It's my team. They've found something in the security logs that requires my attention. Go, Alexander said. We'll continue our research tomorrow. I'll have my driver take you home later. As Yvonne left his office, Alexander turned to the window, looking out at the city bathed in late afternoon light. The kiss had been unexpected but felt somehow inevitable, a natural progression of the connection that had been building between them since they first met. Whether that connection had its roots in their shared ancestry or was something entirely new, Alexander couldn't say. But he knew he wanted to explore it further. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The screen showed a number he didn't recognize. Kingsley, he answered. Mr. Kingsley, a male voice responded, unfamiliar and deliberately modulated, as if through a voice changer. I understand you've been exploring your family history recently. Alexander tensed, immediately alert. Who is this? Someone with a mutual interest in Jonathan Kingsley and his extended family. What do you want? Alexander demanded, his mind racing to identify the caller. Simply to warn you, the voice replied coolly. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. The truth about your family might cost you more than you're prepared to lose. Is that a threat? Alexander's voice hardened. Merely an observation, the caller replied. Ask yourself why your grandfather kept those journals hidden away. Ask yourself why he never spoke of Jonathan's activities after the war. There are secrets in your family tree that could topple everything you've built. Before Alexander could respond, the call ended. He immediately tried to call back, but the number was already disconnected. He stared at the phone, a chill running through him despite the warmth of his office. Someone was watching them, following their investigation, and that someone believed the secrets of the past represented a threat to Alexander's present. The question was, what exactly did they know that he didn't? Alexander immediately called security to trace the mysterious phone call, but as he expected, the number led nowhere. A burner phone, already discarded. Next, he called Yvonne, his fingers tapping impatiently against his desk as he waited for her to answer. "I'm a bit busy right now," she answered, the sound of keyboard clicks audible in the background. "Someone just called me," Alexander said without preamble. "They know about our research into Jonathan Kingsley and Esther. They warned me that pursuing this could cost me everything." The typing stopped. "I'm coming back up," Yvonne said, her voice instantly serious. 10 minutes later, they were seated in Alexander's private conference room, the space secured against electronic surveillance by Yvonne's team earlier that week. "Tell me exactly what they said," Yvonne prompted, her IT specialist's mindset already analyzing the problem. Alexander repeated the conversation verbatim, his memory for details a business skill that served him well in this situation. "They specifically mentioned my grandfather hiding the journals, which suggests they know about the physical documents we have." "Do you think it's connected to Walter's betrayal?" Yvonne asked, her fingers absently touching her ring, a gesture Alexander now recognized as her way of processing complex information. "It has to be," Alexander replied. "The timing is too specific. Walter tries to steal the Takashi documents, then we discover breaches in the personnel files, and now we learn someone was researching Jonathan Kingsley weeks ago." He ran a hand through his hair, a rare display of frustration. "But I still don't see how our family connection could impact Kingsley Enterprises today." Yvonne's brow furrowed in concentration. "What if it's not about the company directly? What if it's about inheritance or ownership?" Alexander shook his head. "My ownership of Kingsley Enterprises is ironclad. I inherited 51% of the shares directly from my grandfather, with the remaining 49% distributed among the board and public investors. There's no legal way to challenge that. Unless—" Yvonne hesitated, then continued carefully, "unless there's evidence of a prior claim that was deliberately suppressed. If Jonathan Kingsley legally recognized his child with Esther in some way, and that recognition was later hidden or destroyed." The implication hung in the air between them. Alexander's mind raced through the possibilities and their potential consequences. "You're suggesting that my great-grandfather William might not have been the rightful heir to the Kingsley fortune," he said slowly. "That Esther's child, your ancestor, had an equally valid claim that was erased from history." "It's just a theory," Yvonne cautioned, "but it would explain why someone sees our discovery as threatening. If there's documentation that Jonathan legally acknowledged his child with Esther, it could theoretically create a claim on the original Kingsley assets." Alexander stood and paced the length of the conference room, his reflection moving across the darkened windows. "The company has evolved so far beyond its origins that such a claim would be nearly impossible to enforce legally. We are talking about events from over 150 years ago." "True," Yvonne agreed. "But even the suggestion of such a claim could create public relations issues, affect stock prices, raise questions about the legitimacy of your position." She paused. "Plus, there's the race factor. The revelation that the Kingsley fortune was built in part on slavery, and that the rightful heirs were deliberately disinherited because of their race, would be a powerful narrative in today's climate." Alexander turned to face her, his expression serious. "Do you believe that? That you have a legitimate claim to Kingsley Enterprises?" Yvonne met his gaze steadily. "I'm not interested in claiming anything that isn't mine, Alexander. I've built my own career, my own life. I didn't start this investigation to find leverage or to make demands." "I know that," Alexander said quickly. "I'm not questioning your motives. I'm trying to understand what we're facing and who might be behind this threat." The tension eased slightly as Yvonne nodded. "Then let's consider who would benefit from this information, or from preventing it from becoming public." They spent the next hour mapping potential scenarios and suspects. Vertex Technologies remained at the top of the list. The competition angle made sense, especially with the Takashi merger on the horizon. but they also considered internal threats, board members who might want to weaken Alexander's position, former employees with grudges, business rivals beyond Vertex. "We need more information about what happened after the war," Alexander concluded. "If Jonathan did legally recognize Esther's child, there should be documentation somewhere." "Dr. Hernandez's graduate student might find something," Yvonne said. "But we should also look into what happened to Esther after she received that property. Where did she go? How did she end up with the surname Porter?" Alexander checked his watch. "It's late. We should continue tomorrow. I don't like the idea of you going home alone after this threat." "I'll be fine," Yvonne assured him, though there was a new wariness in her eyes. "I've dealt with cyberstalkers and corporate threats before, part of being a woman in tech." "At least let security sweep your apartment," Alexander insisted. "If someone's been watching us, they know where you live." After some negotiation, Yvonne agreed to a discreet security check of her building and apartment. Alexander arranged for a team to meet her there and his driver to take her home. Just before she left, Yvonne paused at the door. "About what happened earlier." Alexander knew she was referring to their kiss. "We don't need to discuss it now," he said gently. "There's enough complexity at the moment without adding that layer." A small smile touched her lips. "Using my own words against me?" "Recognizing their wisdom," Alexander corrected, returning her smile. After she left, Alexander returned to his office and poured himself another drink. The threats troubled him, but not enough to abandon their search. If anything, the caller's warning only confirmed they were on the right track. There was something significant to be found in their shared history. His phone chimed with a message from Yvonne. "Security team found nothing suspicious at my place. Heading to bed. Let's talk to Dr. Hernandez's student tomorrow." He texted back a brief acknowledgement, then turned his attention to his computer. Alexander hadn't built a billion-dollar company by allowing threats to deter him. Whoever was trying to intimidate them clearly feared what they might discover, which meant they needed to discover it as quickly as possible. He opened a secure browser and began searching for property records in South Carolina from 1865, focusing on Charleston and the surrounding areas. If Jonathan Kingsley had provided Esther with property, there should be documentation somewhere in the public records. 2 hours and several dead ends later, Alexander was about to give up for the night when he found it. A property deed from September 1865, transferring a small house and plot of land in Charleston to Esther, no surname, a free woman of color, and her daughter Grace. Grace, the name of Esther's daughter, Yvonne's direct ancestor, documented at last. Alexander quickly saved the record and continued searching, now with a specific name to pursue. By dawn, he had assembled a rough timeline. Esther and Grace lived on the property in Charleston until approximately 1868, when records showed the property was sold. The next trace he found was an 1870 census record from Philadelphia showing Esther Porter, age 32, and Grace Porter, age 8, living in a modest neighborhood of free black citizens. The Porter surname appeared to have come from Marcus Porter, the man mentioned in Jonathan's journal. Further research revealed he was a freeman who had worked as a skilled carpenter before the war and established a successful business in Philadelphia afterward. Marriage records confirmed that Esther married Marcus in early 1869, and he legally adopted Grace shortly thereafter. Alexander was so engrossed in his research that he barely noticed the sun rising until his assistant arrived with fresh coffee and a concerned expression. "Sir, you've been here all night?" Alexander blinked, suddenly aware of his rumpled appearance and the stiffness in his muscles from hours of sitting hunched over his computer. "Lost track of time," he explained, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Clear my morning schedule. I need a few hours to rest." "Yes, sir. Though you do have the board meeting at 2 this afternoon. I don't think that one can be moved." Alexander nodded, having forgotten about the quarterly meeting. "That's fine. I'll be ready by then." After his assistant left, Alexander sent his findings to Yvonne, then made his way to the private suite adjacent to his office where he kept fresh clothes and a shower for occasions like this. As the hot water washed away the exhaustion of the night, his mind continued working through the implications of what he'd discovered. Grace Porter, born around 1862 during the Civil War. If she was indeed Jonathan Kingsley's daughter, she would have been conceived while he still owned her mother. The power dynamics of such a relationship were inherently problematic, regardless of any genuine feelings that might have existed. Yet Jonathan's actions after the war, providing property, ensuring Grace and Esther's safety, sending the ring, suggested some level of responsibility and perhaps even affection. After showering and changing, Alexander lay down on the suite's comfortable sofa, intending to rest for just an hour before reviewing the board meeting materials. He dreamed of the plantation, a place he'd never seen but could vividly imagine from historical descriptions. In the dream, he walked through fields of cotton where enslaved people worked under the hot sun. Their faces turned to him as he passed, eyes filled with judgment for the wealth he'd inherited, built on their broken backs. At the center of the plantation stood a grand house with white columns. On the porch, a man he somehow knew was Jonathan Kingsley stood beside a beautiful black woman holding a small child. They were arguing, their voices growing increasingly desperate, though Alexander couldn't make out the words. The woman, Esther, turned away from Jonathan, clutching the child protectively. She looked directly at Alexander, her eyes eerily similar to Yvonne's, and spoke words that echoed around him. The truth cannot remain buried forever. Alexander woke with a start to find Yvonne standing over him, her expression a mixture of amusement and concern. "You know, for a billionaire CEO, you look remarkably vulnerable drooling on your office sofa," she observed. Alexander sat up quickly, checking his watch to find it was already noon. "I fell asleep reviewing the records," he explained, running a hand over his face. "Did you get my message about Grace Porter?" "I did," Yvonne confirmed, taking a seat across from him. "That matches what my mother told me about our family line. Grace Porter was my great-great-grandmother." "You never mentioned her name before," Alexander noted. "I didn't know if it was relevant," Yvonne replied. "There was no way to verify she was connected to the Kingsley family until now." Alexander nodded, fully alert despite his interrupted sleep. "There's more. I found records showing that after Marcus Porter died in 1882, Grace and her mother moved to New York." He paused, the significance of this clear to both of them. They arrived in New York in 1883, just 5 years after the Kingsley family had established themselves there. "They followed them," Yvonne said quietly. "But why? After all those years?" "I don't know," Alexander admitted. "But it can't be coincidence, and it might explain why someone sees our discovery as threatening. If there was continued contact between the families, there might be legal implications we haven't considered." Yvonne's phone chimed with a message. She checked it, her expression sharpening with interest. "It's from Dr. Hernandez's graduate student. She's found something in the Charleston County archives, letters between Jonathan Kingsley and Esther from 1870 to 1875. She looked up at Alexander, her eyes alight with the thrill of discovery. She says they're intimate in nature. Proof of an ongoing relationship, Alexander said, standing up. "We need to see those letters." "She's scanning them now," Yvonne replied. "Should have them by this evening." As Alexander prepared for his board meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The threatening phone call had made it clear that someone was monitoring their investigation closely. The question remained, who stood to lose if the truth about the Kingsley family came to light? The quarterly board meeting dragged on interminably, with Alexander maintaining his usual commanding presence despite his mind being elsewhere. Walter's replacement as CFO presented the financial reports, showing continued growth across all divisions. The Takashi merger was proceeding on schedule, with preliminary approval from regulatory bodies in both the US and Japan. To an outside observer, Alexander Kingsley appeared to be at the height of his powers, fully in control of his corporate empire. Only Alexander himself knew how precariously balanced his attention was, split between the business at hand and the historical mystery that had consumed him over the past week. As the board members filed out at the meeting's conclusion, Douglas Brennan, the most senior member, lingered behind. "A word, Alexander?" Brennan had been on the board since Alexander's grandfather's time, a connection to the company's earlier days. "Of course, Douglas." Alexander gestured to the now empty seats around the conference table. "What can I do for you?" The older man settled into a chair, his weathered face serious beneath a crown of silver hair. "I've noticed you've been distracted lately, ever since the Walter situation." He raised a hand to forestall Alexander's automatic denial. "Your performance hasn't suffered, but I've known you since you were a boy. Something's on your mind." Alexander considered deflecting but decided on a partial truth. "I've been researching some family history. It's taken a few unexpected turns." Brennan nodded slowly. "Your grandfather was always protective of family matters. He believed personal history should remain private." He studied Alexander thoughtfully. "May I ask what prompted this sudden interest?" The question seemed innocent enough, but something in Brennan's tone made Alexander cautious. "Just filling in some gaps in my knowledge, nothing that impacts the company." "Are you certain of that?" Brennan's gaze was penetrating. "History has a way of reaching into the present, especially family history." A chill ran through Alexander. Was Brennan the source of the threat? The timing of this conversation seemed suspicious. "If you have something specific in mind, Douglas, I'd appreciate directness." The older man sighed. "I'm simply concerned. Your grandfather worked very hard to establish the Kingsley name as it's known today. He wouldn't want complications from the past to undermine what he built." He stood, straightening his impeccable suit. "Just be careful where you dig, Alexander. Some foundations are best left undisturbed." As Brennan left, Alexander remained seated, processing the oblique warning. It seemed too coincidental to be unrelated to the threatening call. The question was whether Brennan was directly involved or simply aware of the potential issues surrounding the Kingsley family history. Alexander's phone vibrated with a message from Yvonne. Letters arrived. "My office. You need to see these." 5 minutes later, Alexander was in Yvonne's temporary office on the executive floor, the door securely locked behind him. Spread across her desk were printouts of scanned letters, the handwriting delicate and flowing on pages yellowed with age. "These are from Esther to Jonathan," Yvonne explained, her voice hushed as if in the presence of something sacred. Written between 1870 and 1875, after she had moved to Philadelphia with Marcus Porter. Alexander picked up the first letter, dated April 1870. "My dearest Jay, your letter arrived safely yesterday. Marcus does not question our correspondence, believing as he does that you merely maintain an interest in Grace's education as her former guardian. He is a good man, though he will never hold the place in my heart that you occupied for so many years. Grace grows stronger and more clever by the day. She has your eyes and your quick mind for numbers. I have begun teaching her to read and write, and she absorbs knowledge like the parched earth drinks rain. Sometimes I wonder what might have been had circumstances been different, had we been born in another time or place where our love would not have been deemed so impossible. The ring remains my most treasured possession, a reminder of promises both kept and broken. I understand why you could not acknowledge us publicly, though the pain of that necessity never fully fades. William would never accept the truth, and your position in society would be irreparably damaged. I pray that you are well and that your business ventures prosper. Perhaps one day, when Grace is grown, she might know the full truth of her parentage. Until then, I remain forever." Yuri Alexander looked up at Yvonne, who was watching him intently. "There's no ambiguity here," he said quietly. Jonathan Kingsley was Grace's father, and he and Esther were in love. "Read this one," Yvonne said, handing him another letter from 1872. "It clarifies why they stayed in contact. My dearest Jay, I have received the funds you sent, though I maintain that they are unnecessary. Marcus provides well for us, and I have my seamstress work which brings modest but steady income. I understand your desire to support Grace's education, and for that alone, I accept your generosity. You ask again about our coming to New York. I cannot see how this would be wise. Your wife would surely question your interest in a colored woman and her daughter, regardless of what explanations you might offer. Better that we remain at this safe distance, connected by letters and memories rather than risk discovery." Grace asked about her real father again yesterday. She grows increasingly curious as she ages, noticing as she does the differences between herself and Marcus. I have told her only that her father was a good man who could not remain with us due to the war and its aftermath. This satisfies her for now, but children have a way of seeking truth that adults often avoid. The money you have placed in trust for her future is more than generous. I only pray that she will be able to use it to build a life worthy of your sacrifice. Perhaps she will attend university, as you have suggested. A colored woman with a proper education might forge a path that neither you nor I could have imagined in our youth. With enduring affection, E. Alexander set the letter down gently. He was financially supporting them in secret, and he'd established a trust for Grace. A trust that could potentially be traced to Kingsley assets, Yvonne pointed out, if he used company funds or investments to create it. That would explain why someone sees this history as threatening, Alexander mused. If there's a documented financial link between Kingsley Enterprises in its early form and Grace Porter, it could potentially create a legal basis for a claim. Yvonne handed him a third letter, this one from 1875, the handwriting more hurried and the paper showing water stains that might have been tears. J. Your last letter has left me sleepless for days. You know that I have always understood the impossibility of our situation, have never demanded more than you could safely give. But now you suggest risking everything by acknowledging Grace in your will? I cannot allow this. William suspects something already, you write. Your wife questions the funds that disappear each quarter. Your position grows precarious as rumors circulate, and yet you would cast caution aside after all these years of careful secrecy? I will not have Grace subjected to public scrutiny or made a target of hatred and resentment. The world is not ready for such truths, J. Perhaps it never will be. The trust you established for her education is more than generous and safely anonymous through Mr. Brennan's management. Let that be enough. We have survived by accepting the limitations of our time. Please do not endanger yourself or Grace with grand gestures of recognition that can only bring pain to all involved. The ring you gave me and the bird symbol it bears will remain our private truth, a legacy known only to those who need to know. With love that transcends our circumstances, E. Brennan, Alexander said sharply, looking up from the letter. Douglas Brennan. It mentions him managing the trust. Yvonne's eyes widened. The current board member? But he'd have to be. He's in his early 80s, Alexander confirmed. He joined my grandfather's company right out of law school and has been with Kingsley Enterprises ever since. This can't be coincidence. You think he's the one threatening you? Yvonne asked, gathering the letters protectively. Or trying to warn me, Alexander amended. He approached me after the board meeting today, mentioned my grandfather being protective of family history, suggested some foundations are best left undisturbed. Yvonne frowned. That sounds more like concern than a threat. Either way, he knows something, Alexander said firmly, and I intend to find out what it is. He checked his watch. He usually stops at the Harvard Club after board meetings. I'm going to go talk to him directly. I'm coming with you, Yvonne declared, already gathering her things. This is my family history too. Alexander didn't argue. Despite the complexity of their situation, he'd come to value Yvonne's perspective and presence. Together, they headed to the Harvard Club, where Alexander's membership ensured immediate entry. They found Douglas Brennan in a quiet corner of the reading room, nursing a scotch and perusing a financial journal. He looked up in surprise as they approached, his gaze shifting between Alexander and Yvonne with growing comprehension. "I see you've been more thorough in your research than I anticipated," he said quietly, gesturing for them to join him. "Ms. Porter, I presume." "You know who I am?" Yvonne asked, taking a seat across from him. "I make it my business to know everyone who enters Alexander's orbit," Brennan replied, "particularly when they bear such a striking resemblance to Grace Porter." Alexander leaned forward. "We know about the trust you managed for Grace. We found Esther's letters." He kept his voice low, though the club's atmosphere ensured privacy. "What I don't know is why someone is threatening me over this history." Brennan sighed deeply, suddenly looking every one of his 80-plus years. "Because there's more to the story than those letters reveal," he said. "Much more." He took a sip of his scotch, gathering his thoughts. "I wasn't the original manager of the trust. My father was. He worked for Jonathan Kingsley in the early days of the company, and later for William. He passed the responsibility to me when I joined the firm under your grandfather, Alexander." "So this has been a family secret maintained across generations," Yvonne observed. "More than you know," Brennan confirmed. "The trust wasn't the only thing Jonathan established for Grace. There was also a provision in his original will acknowledging her as his natural daughter and allocating her a 10% ownership stake in Kingsley Trading Company." Alexander felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. That would make her a legitimate heir to the Kingsley fortune. "Precisely." Brennan nodded. "But William discovered the provision before Jonathan died. He confronted his father and demanded the will be changed. When Jonathan refused, William took extreme measures to protect what he saw as his rightful inheritance." "What kind of measures?" Yvonne asked, though her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. Brennan lowered his voice further. "Jonathan Kingsley's death in 1878 was not the heart attack reported in the papers. William poisoned his father to prevent him from formally acknowledging Grace Porter as his daughter and heir. The revelation hung in the air like a thundercloud, dark and foreboding." Alexander felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. The foundation of his family's wealth wasn't just built on the labor of enslaved people, it was secured through patricide. "That's a serious accusation," Alexander said finally. "Do you have proof?" "My father kept a journal," Brennan replied. "He was William's confidant. William confessed everything to him after the fact, partly out of guilt, partly to ensure my father's complicity in maintaining the official story." "But why would someone threaten me now?" Alexander pressed. "This happened almost 150 years ago." "Because William wasn't content with simply murdering his father," Brennan explained gravely. "He also created a false will, destroying the original that contained Grace's acknowledgement, and that act of fraud has implications that extend to the present day." "A fraudulent will?" Alexander repeated, struggling to process the implications. "How does that affect Kingsley Enterprises today?" Brennan's weathered hands clasped his scotch glass tightly. "Under New York law, fraud in the creation of a will has no statute of limitations when it comes to inheritance claims. If it can be proven that William Kingsley falsified his father's will to disinherit Grace Porter, her descendants would have a legitimate claim to the percentage of Kingsley Enterprises that would have been hers." "After all this time?" Yvonne asked, her professional composure momentarily slipping. "Time doesn't erase fraud," Brennan confirmed, "especially when the fraud has been knowingly perpetuated through generations. Your grandfather knew the truth, Alexander. He maintained the deception to protect the company and the family name." Alexander's mind was racing, calculating angles and implications with the precision that had made him a business prodigy. "So someone has discovered this history and is using it as leverage." "That would be my assumption," Brennan nodded. The question is who? Very few people know this particular secret. Myself, of course. Perhaps one or two others from your grandfather's inner circle who might still be alive. Or descendants of Grace Porter who've been researching their family history, Alexander suggested, glancing at Yvonne. Don't look at me, she said firmly. I knew nothing about this until right now, and I have no interest in threatening you or claiming ownership of your company. I believe you, Alexander assured her, but you might not be the only descendant. Grace could have had multiple children, creating several branches of descendants who might have uncovered this history independently. Brennan cleared his throat. There's something else you should know. After Jonathan's death, William became obsessed with eliminating any potential threat to his inheritance. He tracked down Esther and Grace in Philadelphia, intending to deal with them permanently. He was going to kill them too, Yvonne stated flatly, her expression hardening. Yes, Brennan confirmed. But they had already fled to New York, warned by my father, who had remained secretly loyal to Jonathan's wishes. They changed their names again and disappeared into the growing black community in Harlem. That's why we couldn't find records of them after 1883, Alexander realized. They were hiding from William. Precisely. My father helped establish them under new identities and continued to manage the trust Jonathan had created, ensuring that Grace and her descendants received the financial support Jonathan had intended, if not the recognition or ownership stake. Alexander's eyes narrowed. So Kingsley Enterprises has been secretly funding Grace Porter's descendants for generations. A small, discreet stipend, managed through layers of trusts and foundations to obscure its origins, Brennan explained. Nothing that would raise eyebrows on the corporate books, classified as a legacy charitable foundation. Your grandfather continued the payments out of a sense of obligation, though he made it clear to me that the arrangement was never to become public knowledge. Did my mother receive these payments? Yvonne asked suddenly. Brennan hesitated, then nodded. The Porter Educational Trust provided scholarships to all confirmed descendants of Grace Porter. Your mother's nursing education was partially funded through this channel, though she would have been told it was simply a scholarship for promising students of color. Yvonne absorbed this information, her expression a complex mixture of emotions. So, the Kingsley family has been salving their conscience with secret payments while publicly denying our existence. That's one interpretation, Brennan acknowledged. Another is that they were honoring Jonathan's wishes as best they could within the constraints of their time and circumstances. Alexander stood abruptly, pacing a few steps before turning back to Brennan. You said William created a false will. Does the original still exist? I don't know, Brennan admitted. My father never mentioned it being destroyed, but he also never indicated its location. It's possible that William kept it as insurance or leverage of some kind. Or it could have been destroyed decades ago, Yvonne pointed out. In which case, proving the fraud would be nearly impossible without a confession from the perpetrator who has been dead for over a century. An uncomfortable silence fell over their table, each lost in their own thoughts about the implications of this tangled history. Finally, Alexander spoke. Someone believes the original will still exist, or they wouldn't be threatening me over this history. He turned to Brennan. Who else knew about the trust? Who might have access to records that could prove the connection between Kingsley Enterprises and Grace Porter's descendants? Brennan considered the question carefully. The trust documentation would have been kept in the company archives. Only a handful of people would have access. Myself, your executive assistant who manages the archives, perhaps the head of legal affairs. Walter Chambers, Alexander said suddenly. He would have had access to the financial records as CFO. He could have discovered the regular payments to the Porter Educational Trust, traced them back through the years, and attempted to leverage that information by selling it to Vertex Technologies. Yvonne added, the pieces falling into place. But when that failed due to our security measures, they decided on a more direct approach, threatening you directly." "It fits," Alexander agreed. "But why not simply go public with the information? Why the secrecy and threats?" "Because going public would depend on proving the connection," Yvonne reasoned. "Without the original will, it would be your word against theirs. But if they could force you to acknowledge the fraud privately, perhaps in exchange for some concession, they'd have leverage without the burden of proof." Alexander finished her thought. "But this still doesn't explain who's behind it. Walter's in custody being investigated for corporate espionage. He can't be making these threats from jail." Brennan drained the last of his scotch. Perhaps he was working with someone inside Kingsley Enterprises, someone who continues the effort now that Walter has been caught. Alexander's phone chimed with a message. He checked it, his expression darkening. "It's from the same unknown number. Another warning." He showed the screen to Yvonne. "The original will exists. Payment of $50 million to the account below by midnight, or the will and the full story go public tomorrow. Your choice, Mr. Kingsley." "They're escalating to direct blackmail," Yvonne observed, "which means they're desperate or confident, or both." Alexander pocketed his phone, his decision already made. "I don't respond to blackmail. Never have, never will." He turned to Brennan. "Thank you for your candor, Douglas. I'd appreciate your discretion while we address this situation." "Of course," the older man nodded. "But Alexander, consider carefully. If this history becomes public, the repercussions could be severe, not just for you personally, but for the company, the shareholders, thousands of employees." "I'm well aware of the stakes," Alexander replied coolly. "But I'm not going to perpetuate a fraud that's already lasted for generations." As they left the Harvard Club, the evening air was cool against their faces. Alexander's driver was waiting at the curb, but neither of them moved toward the car immediately. "What are you thinking?" Yvonne asked, studying his profile in the glow of the streetlights. Alexander turned to face her, his expression resolute. "I'm thinking that I want to find the original will, if it exists. Not to destroy it, but to finally bring the truth to light." He hesitated, then added, "Whatever that means for Kingsley Enterprises, or for me personally." Yvonne looked surprised. "Even if it means losing control of your company? Everything you've built?" "I didn't build Kingsley Enterprises on fraud and murder," Alexander replied firmly. "My great-great-grandfather did. I've expanded and transformed it based on innovation and strategic vision. If acknowledging the original sin at the foundation requires restitution, so be it." His unwavering gaze held hers. "The question is, where do you stand in all this? You're as much a part of this story as I am. More, perhaps, since it's your ancestor who was wronged." Yvonne was silent for a long moment, the implications of their discovery clearly weighing on her. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "A week ago, I was just an IT specialist with a successful consulting business. Now I'm potentially an heir to one of the largest tech conglomerates in the world, through a great-great-grandmother I barely knew existed." She shook her head slightly. "It's a lot to process." "We don't have to decide everything tonight," Alexander said gently, "but we do need to identify who's behind these threats before they go public or escalate further." "Agreed," Yvonne nodded. "And I think I know where to start." The blackmail message came through a digital channel. Every digital communication leaves traces, no matter how careful someone thinks they're being. A hint of professional confidence returned to her voice. "Give me access to Kingsley's advanced cyber forensics lab, and I can track the origin of those messages." "You'll have everything you need," Alexander promised. "Let's head back to the office." As they settled into the back of his car, Alexander found himself studying Yvonne's face in the shifting shadows. Despite the complexity of their situation, or perhaps because of it, his admiration for her continued to grow. She'd handled each revelation with grace and pragmatism, neither shirking from uncomfortable truths nor allowing them to overwhelm her. "What is it?" she asked, catching his gaze. "I was just thinking that Jonathan and Esther would be proud of how we're handling this," he said honestly. They lived in a time that forced them to hide their truth. We have the opportunity to finally honor it. Yvonne's expression softened. That's a nice thought. Her hand found his in the darkness between them, a simple gesture of connection that somehow transcended the complications of their shared history. Back at Kingsley Tower, the night security team was surprised to see the CEO return so late, but Alexander's authority ensured immediate access to the cyber forensics lab, a state-of-the-art facility normally reserved for the most sensitive company operations. Yvonne moved with practiced efficiency, her fingers flying across keyboards as she bypassed security protocols and deployed specialized tracking software. Alexander watched in admiration, seeing a side of her professional expertise he hadn't fully appreciated before. The messages were routed through multiple proxy servers, she explained as she worked. Standard practice for anyone trying to hide their digital footprint, but even the most sophisticated setups leave traces. After nearly an hour of intense concentration, Yvonne suddenly straightened. "Got it," she announced. "The original connection came from inside this building." "Kingsley Tower?" Alexander's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You're certain?" "Absolutely," Yvonne confirmed, pointing to data streams on her screen. "Not only that, but I can tell you exactly which floor and terminal." She looked up at him, her expression grim. "The messages came from the executive floor, specifically from the office adjacent to yours." Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. "That's Joshua Ward's office, my chief of operations." "Your second in command," Yvonne said softly. "The person who would most likely step into your role if you were forced out." The pieces suddenly aligned in Alexander's mind. Joshua was Walter's closest ally on the executive team. They've worked together for years. His jaw tightened. "And he's been increasingly vocal about taking the company in a different direction than my vision." "Sounds like motive to me," Yvonne observed. "Question is, what do we do about it?" Alexander checked his watch. It was nearly midnight. "We confront him, first thing tomorrow, with evidence, not accusations." His eyes met hers, determination radiating from his gaze. "And then, regardless of the outcome with Joshua, we decide how to address the larger truth about our families." As if on cue, both their phones chimed simultaneously. The same message appeared on both screens. "Time's up. Your silence is taken as refusal. The truth goes public at 9 a.m. The Kingsley dynasty ends tomorrow." Alexander stared at the message, his expression hardening into the steely resolve that had made him one of the most formidable CEOs in the tech industry. "They've made a critical mistake," he said quietly. "What's that?" Yvonne asked, already gathering the digital evidence they'd uncovered. "They've shown their hand too early. We still have 9 hours before their deadline." Alexander checked his watch again. "Joshua normally arrives at 6:30 a.m. He likes to be here before me to review the overnight reports from our Asian operations." "So we intercept him then," Yvonne concluded, understanding his thinking. "But what if he's not working alone? Walter could still be coordinating from wherever he's being held, or there could be others involved." "Possible, but unlikely," Alexander replied. "Walter was never the mastermind type, more of a follower with ambition, and Joshua's always preferred to work independently." He paused, considering their options. "We need to secure the company archives. If the original will exists, it would most likely be there." Yvonne nodded. "And we should prepare for the possibility that they'll release the information regardless of what we do. The truth about your family history and its connection to mine is going to come out one way or another." "I know," Alexander acknowledged, "and I've already decided I won't continue the deception. The question is how we control the narrative and what it means for Kingsley Enterprises going forward." They spent the next several hours preparing on multiple fronts. Alexander contacted his head of security to discreetly monitor Joshua's movements and secure the corporate archives. Yvonne worked with her team to strengthen their digital defenses against potential leaks, while continuing to trace the blackmailer's digital footprint. By 5:30 a.m., they had stationed themselves in Alexander's office, waiting for Joshua's arrival. Alexander looked surprisingly fresh despite the sleepless night, his suit impeccable and his demeanor calm. Yvonne had borrowed clothes from the executive emergency closet, a practice Alexander had instituted years ago for executives working overnight or during crises. "Are you sure about this?" Yvonne asked as they reviewed their strategy one final time. "Once we confront him, there's no going back. The company will never be the same." "I'm sure," Alexander confirmed without hesitation. "Whatever happens with Joshua, the larger truth needs to come out. Jonathan Kingsley acknowledged Grace Porter as his daughter. She and her descendants, including you, deserve recognition of that legacy." Yvonne studied him, her expression thoughtful. "You continue to surprise me, Alexander. Most men in your position would fight to maintain the status quo at all costs." "Perhaps," he conceded, "but I've always believed that running from the truth ultimately costs more than facing it." He paused, then added more softly, "Besides, learning about our shared history has given me something I didn't realize I was missing." "What's that?" Yvonne asked. "A connection to something larger than business success," Alexander replied. "A family story that, while complicated, reminds me that legacy isn't just about wealth or power. It's about the choices we make and the values we uphold." Before Yvonne could respond, Alexander's security chief called to inform them that Joshua Ward had just entered the building. Minutes later, surveillance showed him exiting the elevator on the executive floor. "He's heading to his office first, as expected," Alexander observed, watching the security feed on his tablet. "Let's give him a few minutes to settle in before we approach." Yvonne nodded, the tension in the room palpable as they waited. After exactly 5 minutes, Alexander stood, straightening his already perfect tie. "Ready?" he asked, his voice steady. "Ready," Yvonne confirmed, falling into step beside him as they left his office. They found Joshua Ward hunched over his computer, his back to the door. At 45, Joshua had the sharp features and calculating eyes of a man who had spent his career carefully climbing the corporate ladder. His perfectly tailored suit and meticulously groomed appearance were part of a carefully cultivated image as Alexander's most trusted lieutenant. "Good morning, Joshua," Alexander said calmly from the doorway. Joshua started visibly, spinning in his chair with uncharacteristic alarm before composing himself. "Alexander, you're in early. I didn't expect to see you until the executive meeting at 9. "I imagine you didn't," Alexander agreed, stepping into the office with Yvonne beside him. "We need to talk." Joshua's eyes flicked briefly to Yvonne, a flash of recognition and something else, fear, crossing his features before he masked it with a professional smile. "Of course. What can I help you with?" Alexander closed the office door behind them. "Let's start with why you've been threatening me with exposure of my family history if I don't pay $50 million by this morning." The blood drained from Joshua's face, but he recovered quickly. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Threats? Blackmail? That's absurd." "We've traced the messages to your terminal, Joshua," Yvonne stated flatly. "The digital forensics are conclusive." Joshua's expression hardened as he realized denial wouldn't work. His eyes darted to his desk drawer for a split second, a move that didn't escape Alexander's notice. "Looking for this?" Alexander asked, producing a small USB drive from his pocket. "My security team found it in your locked drawer an hour ago. Interesting reading, detailed research on Jonathan Kingsley, William's fraudulent will, and Grace Porter's descendants." He paused meaningfully, "including complete dossiers on Yvonne and her mother." "You had no right to search my office," Joshua protested, but the fight was leaving his voice. "Actually, company policy explicitly states that all offices and equipment remain Kingsley property and subject to search at any time," Alexander corrected him. "Something you should know, having helped draft that policy." Joshua's shoulders slumped slightly, the first sign of his facade cracking. "How did you figure it out?" You made several mistakes, Yvonne explained. First, assuming that digital messages could be truly anonymous when sent from inside a network I personally secured. Second, underestimating how quickly Alexander and I would piece together our family connection independently of your threats. But your biggest mistake, Alexander continued, was assuming I would pay to keep this history buried. I have no intention of continuing my grandfather's deception. This clearly caught Joshua off guard. He looked up sharply. What? I'm acknowledging the truth, Alexander stated firmly. Jonathan Kingsley was Grace Porter's father. His original will recognized her as his daughter and granted her a stake in what would become Kingsley Enterprises. William Kingsley murdered his father and falsified the will to keep that fortune for himself. Joshua stared at them, momentarily speechless. But that would mean, his eyes darted to Yvonne, that I have a legitimate claim to a portion of Kingsley Enterprises, Yvonne finished for him. Yes, we're aware of the implications. So your blackmail attempt is not only criminal but pointless, Alexander added. I've already decided to acknowledge this history publicly and address the legal ramifications, whatever they may be. Joshua's expression shifted through confusion, calculation, and finally a bitter smile. Well, that's unexpected. But it doesn't change everything. He reached for his computer. I still have all the documentation ready to go public. One click and every major news outlet receives the full story, including some details I doubt you've discovered yet. Such as? Alexander asked, unperturbed. Such as the fact that William Kingsley didn't just murder his father, Joshua replied, his finger hovering over his keyboard. He also tracked down and killed Marcus Porter in 1882, which is why Esther and Grace fled to New York under new identities, or that your grandfather personally destroyed evidence that would have exposed the fraud during a legal challenge in 1952. Yvonne tensed beside Alexander, but he remained outwardly calm. How did you discover all this, Joshua? The company archives wouldn't contain those details. A hint of pride crept into Joshua's voice. My grandmother worked as a housekeeper for your grandfather for 40 years. She overheard things, saw documents, pieced together the truth over decades. She told me stories growing up, rumors at first. But I started researching once I joined Kingsley Enterprises. And Walter? How does he factor into this? Alexander pressed. Walter discovered the trust payments to Porter descendants while reviewing old financial records. He came to me thinking he'd found evidence of embezzlement. Joshua laughed humorlessly. Imagine his surprise when I explained what those payments really represented. So you convinced him to steal the Takashi merger documents as a distraction, Yvonne deduced, while you pursued the real prize, leverage over Alexander through this historical revelation. Joshua shrugged. Walter was always short-sighted, focused on immediate gain. I've been playing a longer game. Which ends today, Alexander stated firmly. Whether you send that information to the press or not, I'm going to address it publicly on my own terms. The only difference is whether you face criminal charges for blackmail and corporate espionage. For the first time, Joshua looked genuinely uncertain. You're bluffing. You'd never willingly give up control of Kingsley Enterprises. You fundamentally misunderstand me if you think I value control over integrity, Alexander replied. Yes, I've worked hard to build this company beyond what my grandfather left me, but I won't continue a legacy built on murder and fraud. Joshua's composure finally cracked completely. Do you have any idea what this will do to the company, to shareholder value, to the thousands of people who depend on Kingsley stability for their livelihoods? I'm well aware of the potential consequences, Alexander acknowledged, which is why I intend to manage this revelation carefully, with a clear plan for moving forward that addresses both historical justice and present-day responsibilities. What do you want from me? Joshua asked, a defeated note in his voice. First, all copies of the documentation you've gathered, Alexander said. Then your resignation, effective immediately. In exchange, we don't press criminal charges for the blackmail attempt. Joshua considered this for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. "Fine. You win, Alexander. As always." He began transferring files to a company server as instructed by Yvonne, who monitored the process carefully to ensure nothing was withheld. When they left Joshua's office 30 minutes later, Alexander had a complete set of the research Joshua had compiled over years, including leads on the possible location of Jonathan Kingsley's original will. "Do you think he'll keep quiet?" Yvonne asked as they returned to Alexander's office. "For now," Alexander replied. "Self-preservation will keep him from doing anything rash before we make our announcement. After that, it won't matter what he says." Yvonne checked her watch. "It's nearly 7. If you're really going to address this publicly, we need to prepare." Alexander nodded, already mentally outlining what needed to be done. "I'll call an emergency board meeting for 8 o'clock. They need to hear this directly from me before it goes any further. Then a company-wide announcement followed by a press conference." "That's moving incredibly fast," Yvonne observed, concern evident in her voice. "Are you sure you don't want more time to prepare to consider all the implications?" Alexander reached for her hand, holding it gently. "I've had generations of my family burying this truth, Yvonne. I won't waste another day perpetuating their deception." He squeezed her hand softly. "Besides, the longer we wait, the more opportunity for someone else to control the narrative." Yvonne nodded, returning the pressure of his hand. "What about us? This will put our connection in the spotlight, too." "That's up to you," Alexander said sincerely. "Whatever you're comfortable with. This is your story as much as mine." Yvonne took a deep breath, the weight of the decision evident in her expression. "Then let's tell it together. The full truth, Jonathan and Esther, William's betrayal, and how their choices echo through to us today." As they began preparing for what would undoubtedly be the most significant day in Kingsley Enterprises' history, Alexander was struck by a profound sense of rightness, despite the chaos that lay ahead. For the first time, he felt truly connected to his family legacy, not the sanitized version presented in corporate histories, but the complex, painful human story that included both terrible wrongs and acts of love that transcended the boundaries of their time. And beside him stood Yvonne Porter, a living testament to that complicated history, her very existence a bridge between past and present. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The Kingsley Enterprises boardroom had never felt so tense. 10 pairs of eyes stared at Alexander in stunned silence as he concluded his presentation. Behind him, projected on the wall-sized screen, was an image of the bird symbol that connected their families, alongside portraits of Jonathan Kingsley and a newly discovered photograph of Esther Porter that Joshua's research had unearthed. "So, to summarize," Alexander said into the silence, "the foundation of Kingsley Enterprises was secured through murder and fraud. William Kingsley killed his father to prevent him from acknowledging Grace Porter as his daughter and rightful heir. The company has been secretly supporting Grace's descendants for generations through the Porter Educational Trust, tacitly acknowledging the connection while publicly denying it." Douglas Brennan, looking older than his years, nodded solemnly from his seat. The other board members remained frozen in various states of shock. "And you intend to make this public?" Victoria Chang, the newest board member, finally asked, her voice carefully measured. "I do," Alexander confirmed. "This morning. The press conference is scheduled for 11. "This will devastate shareholder value," Richard Morris, the head of investor relations, protested. "The stock will plummet. We could face lawsuits, regulatory investigations." "All of which I've anticipated," Alexander interrupted calmly. "I've prepared a comprehensive transition plan." He gestured to the documents distributed before the meeting began. "If you'll turn to page 3, you'll see the legal and financial framework I'm proposing." The board members shuffled through the papers, their expressions shifting from shock to bewilderment as they reviewed Alexander's plan. "You're proposing to restructure ownership of the company," Brennan stated, looking up from the document. creating a new class of shares specifically for verified descendants of Grace Porter. Yes, Alexander confirmed. 10% of Kingsley Enterprises, the portion Jonathan intended Grace to have, will be transferred to a trust benefiting her descendants. I've already instructed our legal team to begin the process of identifying and verifying all legitimate heirs. This is unprecedented, Chang murmured, though her tone suggested reluctant admiration rather than criticism. It's also the right thing to do, Alexander replied firmly. The alternative is to continue a deception that has already lasted far too long. And Ms. Porter? Brennan asked, glancing at Yvonne, who stood quietly at Alexander's side. As the most directly verified descendant, what is her role in this? All eyes turned to Yvonne, who straightened almost imperceptibly before answering. I'll be working with the legal team to establish the trust and identification process. Beyond that, my role will depend on the board's decisions. Alexander continued. I'm recommending that Yvonne be appointed to the board as part of this restructuring. Her expertise in cybersecurity would be valuable regardless of her heritage, but in this context, her presence will also help demonstrate our commitment to addressing this historical wrong. A murmur ran through the room. Not entirely negative, Alexander noted with some relief. He had prepared for outright resistance, but the board seemed more stunned than opposed. We need time to process this, Morris said finally. You're asking us to approve a fundamental change to the company's structure with less than an hour's notice. I understand it's a lot to absorb, Alexander acknowledged. But time is a luxury we don't have. The press conference happens whether you formally approve this plan or not. I'm giving you the opportunity to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. The implied threat wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Alexander rarely issued ultimatums to his board, but when he did, they knew he meant business. I move that we enter executive session to discuss, Chang suggested, without Mr. Kingsley and Ms. Porter present. Alexander nodded. Of course, we'll wait outside. In the hallway outside the boardroom, Alexander loosened his tie slightly. For all his outward composure, the stress of the morning was taking its toll. You handled that well, Yvonne observed. Better than I expected, honestly. They're rational people, ultimately, Alexander replied. They understand that trying to bury this would only make it worse. The question is whether they'll accept my proposed solution or try to fight it. And if they fight? Yvonne asked. Alexander's expression hardened slightly. Then I'll take it public anyway. I still control 51% of voting shares. I don't need their approval, just their cooperation. They waited in tense silence, both lost in their own thoughts about the whirlwind of the past week. It seemed impossible that just 7 days ago, Yvonne had been simply an IT consultant fixing a computer problem for a demanding CEO. After 20 minutes, Brennan emerged from the boardroom. We're ready, he said simply, his expression revealing nothing. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. The board members sat straighter, their initial shock replaced by the composed demeanor of executives who had made a difficult decision. The board has voted to support your proposal, Chang announced, with some conditions. Alexander nodded, unsurprised. Go on. First, we want independent verification of all historical claims before the ownership restructuring is finalized, she explained. The executive committee will appoint a team of historians and legal experts for this purpose. Reasonable, Alexander agreed. Second, we propose a phased implementation of the ownership changes to minimize market disruption. The initial announcement will reference historical truths and intentions for redress, but the specific restructuring details will follow over the next quarter. Also acceptable, Alexander conceded, provided there's a firm timeline and commitment. Finally, Chang continued, we propose that Ms. Porter formally join the company in a senior capacity, specifically as Chief Information Security Officer, before taking a board position. This creates a natural progression that the public and shareholders can understand. Alexander glanced at Yvonne, whose expression remained carefully neutral. "That would be Ms. Porter's decision," he said. "She has her own successful consulting business." All eyes turned to Yvonne, who took a moment before responding. "I would consider the position," she said carefully, "depending on the specific terms and transition plan for my current clients." "Excellent," Chang nodded. "Then we have an agreement in principle." The rest of the meeting focused on logistics for the press conference and immediate next steps. As they concluded, Brennan approached Alexander privately. "Your grandfather would be proud," the older man said quietly. He knew the truth was buried too deep and he lacked the courage to address it. But he always hoped someone would eventually set things right. "Thank you, Douglas," Alexander replied, genuinely moved. "That means a great deal." By 10:45, the Kingsley Tower press room was filled to capacity with journalists from every major outlet. Word had spread that Alexander Kingsley had called an unexpected press conference about a significant historical revelation, triggering speculation that ranged from a major acquisition to a personal health crisis. Backstage, Alexander and Yvonne reviewed their remarks one final time. They had decided to present the truth together, each telling the part of the story that belonged to their family. "Nervous?" Alexander asked, noticing Yvonne adjusting her ring. "Terrified," she admitted with a small smile. "My life changes irrevocably in about 15 minutes. "Second thoughts?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "No, just processing the reality of it all. A week ago, I was Yvonne Porter, independent cybersecurity consultant. Now I'm about to become part of one of the biggest corporate stories in decades." "You'll handle it brilliantly," Alexander assured her, taking her hand briefly, "just as you've handled everything else this week." At precisely 11 o'clock, they walked onto the stage together. Camera flashes erupted as journalists recognized Yvonne from earlier reports about the security breach at Kingsley Enterprises. Speculation immediately intensified. Was this about the corporate espionage case? Alexander stepped to the podium, his commanding presence immediately silencing the room. "Good morning," he began. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Today, I'm addressing you not just as the CEO of Kingsley Enterprises, but as the inheritor of a legacy that contains both achievement and wrongdoing." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Every great American fortune has its origin story. The official history of Kingsley Enterprises begins with my great-grandfather William Kingsley founding a trading company in 1878. That story, while partially true, omits critical facts that have been deliberately suppressed for generations. Today, we correct that historical record. Over the next 30 minutes, Alexander and Yvonne alternated speaking, methodically presenting the evidence they had uncovered about Jonathan Kingsley, Esther Porter, and the legacy of both love and betrayal that connected their families. They revealed William's crimes, the fraudulent will, and the generations of deception that followed. The press room remained uncharacteristically silent throughout their presentation, the magnitude of the revelation keeping even the most hardened journalists spellbound. When they outlined the plans for acknowledging Grace Porter's descendants as rightful partial heirs to the Kingsley fortune, the silence broke into a flurry of questions and camera clicks. Alexander held up his hand for silence. "Before we take questions, there's one more revelation." He turned slightly toward Yvonne. "Ms. Porter has agreed to join Kingsley Enterprises as our new Chief Information Security Officer, bringing her exceptional expertise to help guide the company through this transition and beyond." The announcement triggered another wave of questions, which they addressed with careful precision. Yes, this would impact Kingsley's corporate structure. No, Alexander wasn't stepping down as CEO. Yes, they had evidence supporting all historical claims. No, they weren't concerned about potential lawsuits. They were proactively addressing the historical wrong. By the time the press conference concluded, the story was already dominating news tickers and social media. As predicted, Kingsley stock initially dropped sharply, but stabilized as analysts digested the comprehensive transition plan Alexander had presented. That went about as well as could be expected, Yvonne observed as they retreated to Alexander's office afterward. The hard part is just beginning, Alexander reminded her. But at least now we're facing it honestly. What happens next? Yvonne asked, removing her formal jacket now that the cameras were gone. With us, I mean. This complicates things considerably. Alexander considered her question carefully. I think what happens next is we take some time to adjust to our new reality. You have a company to transition and a new role to define. I have a corporate restructuring to manage and a historical legacy to address properly. Very practical, Yvonne noted with a small smile. But I wasn't just asking about our professional relationship. Alexander moved closer, taking her hand gently. I know, and the honest answer is that I don't want what's growing between us to be overshadowed by all of this. It deserves its own space and time to develop naturally. That's remarkably thoughtful, Yvonne said, genuine appreciation in her voice. Most men in your position would either back away completely or push forward aggressively, claiming that life is too short for hesitation. I'm not most men, Alexander reminded her with a hint of his characteristic confidence. And what's between us isn't most relationships. Yvonne looked down at the ring on her finger, the tangible link between their families that had started this extraordinary journey. No, it certainly isn't. 1 month later, the Smithsonian Museum of American History opened a new exhibition, Divided Legacy, the Kingsley Porter Story. At its center stood a display case containing 2 precious artifacts, Jonathan Kingsley's gold pocket watch and Esther Porter's ring, temporarily donated by their respective owners. Alexander and Yvonne stood before the display, shoulders nearly touching as they read the exhibition text detailing their shared ancestry and the complex history of race, power, and love in America. Do you think they would approve? Yvonne asked quietly. Jonathan and Esther? Alexander considered the question seriously. I think they would be astonished that we could acknowledge their relationship openly, that their descendants could stand together publicly without fear or shame. Progress of a sort, Yvonne observed, though it took over 150 years. Some truths take time, Alexander replied, but they find their way to the light eventually. As they left the museum, walking side by side into the bright afternoon sunlight, their hands found each other naturally. Ahead of them lay challenges and opportunities neither could have imagined a few short months ago, a shared future born from a shared past, a new legacy they would build together. The bird symbol that had connected them across time and circumstance had represented different things to different generations. For Jonathan, it was a promise of freedom he couldn't fully deliver. For Esther, a token of love that transcended impossible boundaries. For their descendants, a mystery that led to uncomfortable truths. But for Alexander and Yvonne, it had become something else entirely. A reminder that the most meaningful connections often come when we least expect them, and that even the most carefully buried truths eventually find their way to those ready to receive them. If you enjoyed today's video, I'm sure you'll love the next one. Don't waste time. Just click on the screen.